A lot of the work that you guys do is either related to collisions or hazards, and also proactive activity. But
that's pretty much what I was saying, that our calls for service in a way that is different than most. But we do respond to those calls for service, but sometimes that call for service can too be delayed by what's going on and different things, but it's more policy driven.
thank you, Commissioner. So that accurately describes everything that I would have said. Dr. Raphael or Co-Chair Raphael, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, and I do think if we're trying to think about making comparisons of outcomes between officer initiated and calls for service, it's helpful to hear that what you have discretion, what you don't, and then also perhaps it's something that we should pay some attention to is proportionally how important are calls for service in overall activity relative to officer or deputy initiated stops as well. So I think that a fertile topic for us to be looking into.
Thank you. Any other questions or points of discussion for the draft outline for the 2022 RIPA report? At this time, I'd like to open it up to public comment. I know we have some members of the public on the line, so thank you all for joining us. Glad to see the active participation. And yeah, go ahead. Was there something else from DOJ? So we'll open it up to public comment. And
no,
what is
board member has been. Oh.
Okay. What has worked well in the past is to divide our public comment into three groups: Northern, Central, and Southern California. Historically, we have had the largest attendance and public comment involvement from folks in Southern California. And so why don't we begin down south and open up public comment to anyone from Southern California who'd like to address the board.
Hi, this is Michelle Wittig. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yes, I appreciate that the board is mainly concerned with systemic issues and not with individual officers. But researchers and agency supervisors have an interest in individual officer behavior across time. Does the STOP database make it possible to track the data from individual officers across time while still maintaining anonymity to the extent required by law? And if it's not possible to answer this question in the moment, would it be possible to receive an answer after the meeting? My email is available to the host of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask you just to restate your questions and make sure that we understand it?
Sure. Does the STOP database make it possible to track the data from individual officers across time while still maintaining anonymity to the extent required by law? This would involve assigning an officer a number or anonymous code that will be maintained across time so that individual officer behavior can be assessed for that officer, even though that officer's name is not known to the public or to those who don't have access to it. Thank you.
Okay. Our next person for public comment.
Hi, good morning. This is Ava Bitran. I'm a staff attorney with the ACLU of Southern California. Thank you to the board and to the DOJ for this opportunity and for the outline. I'd like to just begin by echoing calls that we heard on the board for incorporating a potential screening mechanism for personally identifiable information into the system check at the kind of outset point where DOJ receives the data. And the ACLU is happy to be a thought partner on how to implement this if that would be useful to the department. I also was really pleased to see the focus in the draft report outline on policies. Having attended these meetings now for a couple of years, I'm pleased to see the board go in that direction and to focus on specific areas where the data leads to calls for changes. Specifically here, glad to see the focus on consent and parole probation searches, and I'd like to just encourage conversations with people who've been impacted by these policies as DOJ and the board think about how to sort of incorporate those recommendations from constituencies that might not be as represented here in this space or on the board. And then finally, echoing Board Member Ochoa, I'd like to encourage the board to consider data integrity issues with respect specifically to the proposed report section on police interactions with people who they identify to be transgender. And again, I know there's been some discussion in the past about officers misunderstanding and misapplying the terms transgender woman or transgender man. And I hope the board will consider looking into providing additional training on how to fill this portion of the stop record, and then in evaluating whether the data submitted until now is in fact an accurate record of those stops. So thank you for this opportunity to comment, and I look forward to future meetings.
Thank you. Do we have another presenter or public comment
Yes.
participant from Southern California?
I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, sir, we can.
Thank you. A lot of time has been spent speaking about data, and everything that we do here is data-driven. Yet, we know, and we have long known, that the data has no integrity. It seems to be given short shrift. I believe that if we continue to ignore the data quality issues that have been proven by many offices of Inspector General, this board shall not have met its mandate, and the public shall have been misled. I think we need to do a whole lot better on that. I'll give you an example. I have validated data from the San Diego Sheriff's Office to the stop data records. And what happens quite regularly is that the ethnicity of a person stopped changes between the time they're stopped and the citation record is written and when the whole record is written. Now, those things are glaring and they're obvious, and I dare say that the DOJ knows of it. Certainly, the San Diego Sheriff knows of it, but nothing is being done. The San Diego Police Department is another example. Over 12,000 field interviews have been excluded from their reports to the DOJ. The DOJ knows of it, and nothing is being done or said. The data has no integrity, and it ought to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from Southern California? Hearing none, we'll move to Central California. And lastly, to Northern California. Okay, one final call for any other public comment. Okay, hearing none, we'll go ahead and close public comment. I have a question for DOJ staff as it relates to the agenda and the timing and so forth. We have scheduled a break right now, and then we have a come back to board discussion of the 2022 report, another opportunity for public comment, and then discussion of next steps before we adjourn. We are obviously ahead of schedule. So So just ask DOJ, is there more to discuss related to the 2022 report, or what is next on our agenda?
So we did schedule a break. If the board can also choose to skip the break if you'd like, but to allow people some time to do work and eat lunch if they'd like, other things. But I think the broader discussion of the 2022 report, you've already all started that with your discussion of the outline, but I think it's really a continued discussion about the report overall, and what the board would like to see in it, anything that was left out of the outline, or anything the board has questions about. So you all started this discussion with the discussion of the outline, but I think it's then opening it up to a broader discussion about anything that the board wishes to see with the report, or any questions you might have.
Okay. We have a half an hour scheduled for our break. We're actually right on track right now at 12:10. Do we want to take a full half an hour for lunch and others, or do you want to take about 15 minutes and then reconvene?
Chief Swing, I wonder how much more discussion there is, given that we have had discussion, and so I wonder if maybe a query of the board members, if there's something more that they do want to get into, then we can reserve time for that. But if not, I'd be inclined to press on and give ourselves and the community back time if we need it, if we can do it.
Thank you for that recommendation. I'm supportive of that as well.
Yeah, Edgar Hampton as well.
So I'll ask thank you.
Fine.
Okay, I'll ask is there anyone opposed to just continuing on and skipping the break at this point? All right, sounds like none. So thank you for that recommendation, Board Member Guerrero. Appreciate that. And we'll continue with our board discussion of the 2022 report and open the floor, if you would, to other additional comments and discussion for the 2022 RIPA report.
Put it in the comments, but I'm just curious I think it was Board Member Kajabi who flagged the thought of, in the context of whether we continue with the veil of darkness, the kind of resource allocation issue, and I'm curious to hear from DOJ if that is a significant endeavor, or because it was already done before, if it's easy to just plug and play from prior years' analyses, so that's not a huge time commitment to do that, or if we want to maybe consider trade-offs for engaging in other kinds of things for this year, other kinds of analyses for this year.
I'm looking at our report from San Bernardino County, and because it is and I think our sheriff's department, they're always very responsive to me if I ask for something. And so it is something we want to pay attention to because people complain constantly, well, this stuff happened to me at night. It didn't happen during the day. So we're trying to keep an eye on it so we can have meaningful conversation with people and have data to back up our conversation. I'm not sure how much time it takes, how much additional time it takes. So that is a question that we should look at, but I believe it's just a couple questions on a form. Sheriff McMahon, do you have an answer to that? Is it just a couple checks on a form?
Yeah, I believe it is, Pastor. It's just all part of the database when the deputies fill out the form when they stop somebody.
Sorry, I'm referring to the veil of darkness analysis that the DOJ runs. That's kind of like a quasi-experimental analysis, not the collection of the data piece.
Wondering how much more time that takes. Does anybody know how much more time it takes?
I'm sure someone will, hopefully from DOJ, can weigh in with more detail, but I'll just say that it's a little more complicated than some of the other stops because it involves figuring out time of day rather relative to daylight hours, and some people even wonder, Should you look at the weather patterns? So it's only, roughly speaking, it's only looking at stops in a narrow time band where sometimes of year it might be light and sometimes of year it might be dark, to figure out if to what extent can officers see into cars, and is that affecting stop practices? That's maybe one way to characterize what this methodology is. And so it ends up taking a lot of time on the analysis side. It doesn't change how the data is collected, but just in terms of setting things up, which I think is why Board Member Ochoa was asking about how much DOJ sort of analysis time is it taking, or does it take that resource away from other questions we look at more closely? And I guess maybe I'd add to the question, we should ask, like, is this methodology telling us something, that points to policy that the other methods are not? And if it isn't, and if there's some controversy around this analysis, then does it become less useful to pursue for the next reports? That was how I understood it.
The reason I'm bringing it up is because in a lot of our police forums, we want to be prepared to address that, because in some settings, as we talk about positive policing practices, you might have a team that is accused of being more violent toward the community at night, and so we want to know, does that really happen? Should that team be broken up and other officers put with that team to help prevent any kind of unusual practices at night? So I personally want to keep an eye on that type of data, because it could give us a pattern that we need to address.
Thank you, Board Member Kennedy, for sharing that. I'm wondering, are you saying that there's a concern that policing in nighttime shifts, and I'll say night, not just meaning, let's say 5 to 6, sort of what some people might call a twilight, that changes during the course of the year, whether it's light or dark, but you're saying nighttime practices, there's a concern that those could differ from daytime.
That is a concern in the community, and we have to be able to address that properly, and data will help us address it properly. So if that's not happening, here's the data. In this area, we don't, and I'm particularly concerned about what happens in San Bernardino, because I work there. But if we have accusations from community members saying, every time it gets dark, we get harassed, what we need to know is there data that supports that? And if so, how can we address that? But we haven't seen that pattern in the data, at least the 2019 data, haven't seen it. So we're just kind of concerned. We want to keep our eyes on that kind of data.
I think
it kind of sounds like you're asking for an accounting of use of force incidents in day versus evening hours or nighttime hours, and I wonder if that's a different analysis that maybe we should be asking for, if that's something that the community is looking for that information, if that's a different kind of analysis that we might be wanting to look into. But that seems like something that's a little bit different than the veil of darkness. But if that's a question, though, that you're saying is of interest to the community and is useful for law enforcement to know the answer to, then that might be a separate question that I might want to ask.
Not sure. Will the veil of darkness analysis help us better understand that?
I think the thinking behind the veil of darkness is it's meant to be a test for discriminatory behavior. The idea being that during some times of the year at 6 o'clock it's light, at other times of the year at 6 o'clock it's dark. And if we see, African American motorists more likely to be stopped when it's light than when it's dark, holding the day and the time, whether it's a Wednesday and the hour constant, then it suggests that, when officers can see the race of the person driving, they behave differently than when they can't. So that's, hence the veil of darkness. And when we did hear from the team from Connecticut, their approach seemed to be, well, we have this test, it's imperfect for this reason. We have hit rate analysis, which is if you're searching people, what's the likelihood that it actually generates some sort of contraband or weapons discovery? And if there's a difference, that's suggestive of disparate treatment. And then other sort of, measures like proportion of stops where, no citation is issued or that are, equipment versus moving. And their approach seemed to be, we have all of these different things we can do. And then, if we have kind of pinging on all measures, it seems to suggest a department that, needs to take a look at what they're doing and whether everything that's being done is necessary, and if there's some practice there that is generating discriminatory outcomes. So I think for that reason, and again, we have to be a little humble in the sense that we can do these tests, and there's a body of research about each one that points out their strengths and weaknesses. None of them are perfect. But lining them all up one next to the other, when they all point in one direction, they're suggestive of a problem. What I wonder and maybe Kevin has something to add, is if you've written the R code to do this in past years, is it hard for you to do it again? Like, does the twilight hour shift from year to year, or can you rely on last year's satellite data or whatever it is that's used to figure out the amount of light during a given time period? Or is it kind of starting from scratch each year? Because I remember when you were first doing that analysis, that it was a pretty hefty undertaking, and I've heard that from other researchers as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so to speak to that part, yes, we do have code from previous years that we've used to produce the analyses, and so a lot of the upfront legwork can build upon what we've done previously, and so we're not reinventing the wheel every year moving forward with performing this sort of analysis. That being said, every analysis that we run does take time to run, to go over the results, to write them up, and so the VOD, not unlike any other analysis, by performing that does take staff time and resources, and so therefore it can detract from the amount of other analyses we can perform. So but to speak more directly to, do we have existing information that we use to run the analyses? Yes, we do. We do have to rerun and find out the twilight times every year, because it does vary year to year. And so it's a process that we have to rerun every year. So we can't just reuse our times from the previous year, unfortunately. But we have a process already in place that automates some of that, and so we rely on that. Last year, we would, again this year, if we were to produce those analyses again this year. I think another question that I was hearing that I kind of wanted to comment on is this idea of VOD being a comparison of whether stops during night differ from those during the day across, I don't know, I think I heard use of force thrown out there as an example. VOD is not designed to speak to that, and so if people are interested in that, that would be a different set of analyses. VOD, as Steve has explained, more so to look for disparities in the decision to stop behavior potentially. And so it is one test for examining those disparities, but it is not the only test. And I just want to second everything that Lily and both Steve said about Connecticut's presentation last year, in that they present VOD as one test among a battery of tests that they perform in their state, and that this terminology that they've used as gold standard, as Lily pointed out, was mainly speaking to the fact that VOD is maybe less prone to false positives than other tests, and in what their state does with using their battery of tests up front to kind of triage and establish what agencies for a particular year that they're going to focus on working back and forth with about their specific data, assigning more weight to tests that are less prone to false positives may work for their method there in Connecticut, but it's not necessarily the same method that the RIPA board's using here to perform analyses. And so people should keep that in mind when thinking about past presentations about VOD and this terminology being used as gold standard. It is one test among a battery that they use, and it is one test among a battery of tests that the RIPA board has employed previously and may perform moving forward, depending on the discussion that you all have here today and moving forward.
Would that be maybe 50% less work than previously, or 40% less work? You have any idea?
VOD doesn't constitute 50 or 40, anywhere near that amount of our time. Staff time, we don't spend 40 or 50% of our time on any one analysis because we do so many, or analysis because we do so many. Are you talking about 50% more work year to year?
No.
Like
I mean, for the veil of darkness analysis, when you have to do it this year because you have some upfront work done, does that mean you might spend maybe 50% less than the previous year? And because I want to make sure Ms. Ochoa's question is answered as best as possible.
No, okay, yeah. So last year, staff at the department developed a process that automated some of the methods, and so I don't have an exact number, but it should take less time this year than it took last year. But it would be a comparable amount of time, although I don't have a breakdown anywhere on how much staff time was spent on each individual analysis. We don't track that. But it should take less because we already have existing code that we worked on last year that was new last year, and we would be able to reuse this year. We had a process in place. Just like last year, we improved over the VOD approach that we had in the previous year's report. I can't remember. That would have been the 2020 report. We made improvements that streamlined the process last year. Similarly, we would have those this year from last year's. And so it would be a reduction in the amount of time. I can't say exactly what percentage it would be, but it wouldn't take as much time this year as last year. I will say that the VOD is a unique analysis in that it requires information about where stops took place so that we can determine whether each stop fell within the twilight period, the inner twilight period of stops that are included in that sort of analysis. And so that analysis outside of the staff time required to actually perform the analysis, look over the results, write them up, make any of the appendix content, etc., as we do with all the analyses. There's also an additional process of sourcing the relevant location information that takes time at the beginning of the time period when the department has received the data, and the closeout period for the previous data collection period is ended. And so that's generally it takes multiple weeks to complete that process. It's an IT process. It's not handled by the staff that do the analyses. And so we do have that process specifically so we can get the information that we need to do VOD. And so VOD is unique in that form, in that it requires that upfront time for the sourcing of location information, whereas the other analyses don't. And so if you count that time, VOD does take quite a bit more time overall than other analyses. But what I will say as far as allocation of that time for this year, we're already 2 weeks into that time, that task being carried out. And so if the board decides that they didn't want to move forward with VOD, we're not going to get these 2 weeks back at this point. And so just a consideration there as well.
I remember that veil of darkness was used as a way to try and determine officer actions based on time of stop as opposed to post-stop. Are there other methods that are available? This is obviously for Kevin Walker. Are there other methods that are available for DOJ to evaluate pre-stop decisions?
There may be other methods. Of the ones that the board has looked at, the only two analyses that really look at this question of who do officers stop rather than what actions do they take after they stopped individuals are the VOD that they've that's been included before, and then also the comparison to the residential benchmark data is also kind of a comparison or an analysis that looks at who's stopped compared to some benchmark. And so these are both, VOD is an alternate form of creating a who's stopped benchmark. And so the other common approach would be using some sort of population-based benchmark, which the board already does. So this is just an alternative, and those are the only two methods that really are included in the board's report. So by removing VOD, you'd have one now, which could free up time for some other post-op actions. But yeah, there are two approaches that get at the same type of comparison.
And benchmark to population is difficult because of the different draws and transitory nature of individuals. They could be in a community for employment, tourism, or other reasons that may not be reflected in a population demographic. So I think that's why we chose to add Veil of Darkness, is to help analyze that a little bit deeper. I mean, another solution would be to change the form to add a checkbox for the officer to identify if they were aware of the individual's perceived ethnicity prior to the stop. However, I have heard from the board, and I've heard from my colleagues on the board and from the public, there's some questions around data integrity, and I'm afraid that if that were used, there would be questions again about data integrity in that space. So I don't think that's a viable solution at this time until we address the data integrity questions.
Yeah, and I know that this is Andrea Guerrero. I know that we have covered this ground year over year about what is the appropriate measure to understand bias in policing, right? And Chief Swing, you may recall, and others may have been involved, that we had a dedicated meeting on this in January or February of 2019 with data experts, exclusively about this issue of how do we measure bias? What's the appropriate data set to be looking against, right? And there were pros and cons to Veil of Darkness. There were pros and cons to looking at census tract information. We have had a community member who's a part of this meeting as well, Dr. Karen Glover, who suggested traffic data, or specifically accident data, because that would encompass who's in the area at the time. And so, what I think we've concluded is right now there is no definitive measurement, right? And hopefully in real time, such a measurement will be developed by academics and experts in the field, but we don't quite have one yet. So every measurement has to be taken with a grain of salt. And I think, there have been significant concerns raised about Veil of Darkness, because it's not just about the hour of the day, but it's also about the lighting in the community and what you can see and cannot see. So, I think if it's, and we actually voted on whether to proceed with it or not about a year and a half ago, and I proposed that we not proceed with it, but the board decided that we do. So just wanted to provide that historical context, and also where we are, which is we don't have a good measurement, and we shouldn't pretend that any of these discussed measures are getting us to what we need to know, right? They're informative, but they're not definitive. And so, I guess it's up to, as a board, we've already taken a decision on this once, but if we want to revisit it, certainly we could. I think the more important question is what kind of measurement can we develop, or can we work with academics to develop, that gives us a better sense of the bias that we're seeing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we have to recognize that any methodology we use and the data itself, it's consistently imperfect. There is no perfect solution, and we have to understand that and accept that to a certain extent. Other comments or discussion on our next steps for the report?
Chief Swing, I would just add, and this might be an element for the introduction, but there's so much exploration going on right now in the policing reform world. You know, a lot of conversations, a lot of experiments going on right now around the country, and it may be value to contextualize this moment in time in the introduction and what as a country we're undergoing, right? It's a national reckoning and it's a national exploration, and we talk a lot about best practices, but there may very well be what some people call next practices that have not yet been developed, but that are being developed in real time right now. So maybe that's just a footnote, but and something for context setting for the introduction that may be valuable to mark this moment and what's going on in this country.
I think this is a very timely report, and we have historically had a section or part of our introduction that speaks to the larger conversation around bias and policing, and I think that's appropriate to include here as well.
I also want to endorse that approach that Board Member Guerrero mentioned, that yes, we may not be able to see in practice some of what the best practices actually are, because that's for the future. And to the extent that there's any of the things that I raised as a potential area of focus for the report, particularly around like connecting to lower level infractions and the disparities in that search, to the extent I know that often we can't change course at a certain point, so to the extent that that is not something that we can just go ahead and incorporate into the things that are already presently in the report, if there's some discussion that we need to have about whether or not that can happen, I would just like to have that now so that we have done that. Otherwise, if that is something that can be folded into what we're talking about, I'd be happy to see that.
I'm not sure, Board Member Ochoa, that I fully understand the question. You talked about folding things in, and I'm not sure what those things are and so forth.
Yeah, earlier I had mentioned kind of both expanding on Board Member Raphael's statement about wanting to discuss pretextual stops and wanting to discuss disparities in reasons for stops. That wasn't listed as one of the categories under tests for racial and ethnic disparities. And so I didn't know if that's something that would be folded under there, or if that's something that would be a separate kind of policy-focused area as terms of identifying disparities coming from Black and Latino individuals versus whites, in particular, being stopped for things that are minor infractions, not basis for stops really for anyone else, etc. Because as we've seen in real time, that is a tremendous area where that leads to serious uses of force, killing of individuals for things that most people would probably not even believe should be a basis of a stop in the first place. So we just identifying that practice so that local jurisdictions can better determine how they want to address that.
Yeah, I don't know that our data set gets that granular. I know it. I believe
that
it
it
gets
did
down.
have the stop reason for a stop if it was an infraction we talked about.
Yeah, I believe it gets to mechanical violation as opposed to a mover. It doesn't get as granular as to the type of moving violation mean the code section. For example, something hanging from the rearview mirror or tinted windows or brake light, things of that nature. But I believe it does get down to the level of detail if it was a mechanical violation or a safety or moving violation.
Mhm. And even some of the other stops, for instance, I thought that it does require the section violated, but even things like jaywalking or trespassing or other kind of more minor infractions, and seeing who is being stopped for those, and then what is happening as a result of those stops.
Hi, this is Kevin from DOJ, if I may interject here with some information. So for the reason for stop, when officers are filling that out, they'll select the primary reason for why they stopped an individual, and there are categories such as traffic violation, reasonable suspicion, etc. And if officers select either a traffic violation or reasonable suspicion, then they're required to fill out an additional field with some clarifying information. For traffic violations, they'll indicate what type of traffic violation they observed. So there's 3 categories. There's equipment violations, moving violations, and non-moving violations. And then, so they'll select one of those from that list, and those are those 3 categories that I believe that you, Chief Swinger, are talking about. And then they'll also indicate the vehicle code section that they believe that the person violated. And so from our view here at the department, we see CJIS codes, but when I think on the user interface on the front end that our officers are seeing, they can also go through and select from vehicle code sections and look them up that way. And so we do have some of that information, and then when they select reasonable suspicion, they also will select a subfield for the type of reasonable suspicion, and if they and then the crime, so like the penal code or health and safety code, etc. section that they believe the person they observed a violation of, and so they would provide that. And so we could also take a look at that as well. That's information that officers are required to transmit. So we'll get 1 code per stopped individual, because it's the primary reason. So if officers stop somebody because they observe multiple offenses, it's the primary reason for stop, so they'll submit 1 code, but we will have 1 code per stopped individual. To get at some of these ideas of I don't know personally what the vehicle code or whatever governs, like not having something that obscures the driver's vision of the road. There would be like a air freshener hanging from the mirror. We would need to know, okay, what's that vehicle code section that governs that? I'm assuming it's a vehicle code section. And then we could go into data and then identify stops where officers indicated that was the primary reason for the stop. So if we had like a list of areas that the board was interested in looking at for the types of stops that what was the term we were using? Pretextual stops. If there are specific types of stops where board members felt that these are the types of stops where it's more likely that these are pretextual stops, we could then get the code sections for those types of offenses and then identify stops where officers indicated that was the primary reason for the stop within the data, and then do some analyses on that subset of stops.
Would it be possible for DOJ to provide just like a frequency chart like that? Would you be able to easily run kind of, these are all the vehicle code sections and the frequency with which they were, and then we could substantively look at them and see what we think those are? Me or ACLU or subcommittee or whatever, not DOJ, could just look at them and say, okay, well, there's the distribution. If it's only 1 stop, that's there's no point of analyzing that. But if there's a significant number of stops on this particular vehicle code section, maybe there's 10 of them or whatever, then you might want to look at what they actually are and see if those correspond to things that we're actually seeing in the community. Because things like not having a bike light, that's been something that there've been multiple killings that are based on being stopped on, I know locally. I don't know the frequency with which people get stopped for that, generally speaking. So I'd be interested to see just the vehicle code section and the frequency to be able to take a first step into looking at that question.
So, specifically, just so I understand. Oh, sorry, Nancy.
I was going to say, sorry, Kevin. I was going to say, Melanie, the other thing I wanted to add is that I think I know some of what you're getting at, and there are also code sections or ordinance sections if the person is cited, given a verbal warning, or arrested. So those we could look at the code section, at whatever the penal code section is, or the vehicle code section as a result of a stop as well. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a possible issue. I know a lot of times folks get pulled over and then they end up going to jail for resisting arrest or obstruction. And so those are the types of things you can find out later on as well.
Yeah, I think looking at both would be amazing, to look at what's going in, because some of those things may not even end in any kind of after action, right? There might not be an arrest or a citation, but some of that person has been stopped nonetheless. And then also at the outcome, because yes, exactly as you mentioned, this initial stop might be for something super minor, and then there's an arrest for something that arises as a result of the stop in the first place.
For the reason for stop categories that you're interested in looking at, like a frequency distribution for how many stops were there for this specific vehicle code section, you're interested in the vehicle. Like, I just want to make sure that we're narrowing correctly when I'm thinking about how we would go about doing this. We'd be looking for traffic stops for traffic violations, and then looking at the vehicle code sections. Do we want that broken down by the sub traffic violation type, like broken down by, okay, these are the vehicle code sections when officers indicated that they made an equipment violation. These are the vehicle code sections and their frequency when they indicated those were a moving violation. Or is that level of detail or splicing the data not as interesting to you at this point at the exploratory phase?
That'd be super helpful to see, like, and that, so that, looking at the numbers, I'm not going to have any context for that. So knowing at least that those numbers all fall under this kind of umbrella would be very helpful and useful. I'm throwing out vehicle code because that is something, especially like the non-moving violations, that's something that automatically seems pretty minor. But I mean, there's lots of penal code violations, I'm sure, that are also very minor, or we would consider them to be minor infractions. So, I mean, I don't know if this is like, to do this process, this is like DOJ having to look up each vehicle code number and write it down and then put it into a spreadsheet, or if this is something that's like a run and then just creates something that's like this with like everything just listed out with their frequency. So, I mean, in an ideal situation, I would like to see also like the penal code, any code violations that are the kind of basis for stop. But I don't know if that's a tremendous amount of work or if that's like a easy thing to produce based on the data you have.
Eve, did you have something to add about this? I saw that you kind of looked like you were about to talk.
Oh yeah, I did have some thought, and this might be a request that then perhaps can feed into us thinking about policies to just minimize stops that, or the number of stops that perhaps are unneeded. But I mean, in projects that I've worked on for agencies, sometimes one of the things that I'll do, if I need more detail on what's happening in a stop, and especially if there's a penal code or vehicle code specific infraction, is, you can look for one group, sort them, and just identify the top 5 or the top 6. Because there are things that happen over and over and over again, like, driving without a license, without insurance, with an expired registration, or some combination of the 3. Oftentimes are, a very, very frequent thing that you see, and where you see a race disparity. And, maybe if we knew that we had a disproportionate contribution of these particular, sources of stops, then we can think creatively about, is there something the DMV could be nudging people on that side to make it easier to renew the registration, or some other, creative way to kind of eliminate that as a problem in the first place, and then perhaps narrow. But for the purposes of and I believe Board Member Ochoa, if I'm getting this wrong, let me know. But maybe if we knew that there are these equipment non-moving violations, and we just pick like the top 5 most frequent categories where there might be some purchase to actually make an impact by thinking about a creative policy that would avoid those stops in the first place. Maybe that's a productive way for us to think, and it gets us out of this, does the veil of darkness say that there's, or does it's just looking specifically at the content of stops and then trying to think about if there's another way to basically run things.
That's exactly where I'm trying to get to. Thank you. So that's the goal. So it's a question of looking at low-level stops. It's kind of like without looking at the data, I don't know what the low-level stops are that are being used in a particular agency. And I think an important point that Rafael mentioned too is that it might vary by agency, right? In one jurisdiction, this might be their go-to thing. If they want to stop someone in another jurisdiction, this might be their go-to thing. So there's the top 5s might be different in different agencies, but the function is essentially the same. So without looking at the data, it's hard for me to know the best information to be transmitted. But maybe or you could take a look at the data first pass and see, and then kind of provide a sense of what the best next steps are based on what you see.
So just a consideration on what to anticipate based on kind of some of the discussion here. There are thousands of codes that officers have at their disposal to enter for the reason for stop values. And so if we do unfiltered, just how many times did each of these codes pop up in the database, those frequency tables would go on for, we'd probably put them in an Excel sheet or something like that so that users can filter them. But there are going to be thousands of different codes to look over the frequencies for. Whereas the approach that I think Dr. Rafael was talking about would be to kind of identify the top X number of times that codes, the top 5, I think, was the number of codes per identity group for a given reason for stop. Type, subtype, which would be a manageable table rather than looking through thousands. But I don't know if the idea would be to look at all of those thousands of different codes that may have one or thousands of observations in them. So,
in my mind, so I'm thinking of this as like a project that we could work on, particularly with like assistance over the summer, to kind of get to some of these things. And I don't think anything that's like a one stop is helpful, but I don't know personally if the top 5 are going to be all felonies or where they start using kind of the more minor infractions as the bases for stops, if that more tends to not arise until they get to kind of numbers 15 through 20, but they're still pretty high because there's so many stops overall, and so tackling those would still reduce the number of stops. So that's what I'm saying. Without having looked at it, it's hard to say where the appropriate cutoff is. I don't know what the distribution looks like. I don't know if they're all pretty similar and they just kind of taper down like little by little. I don't know where the more minor infractions would fall in that distribution. So that's the issue, is I'm trying to identify what are the low-level things that are driving this. I'm not sure when they crop up. So I definitely wouldn't want, but I do want things that are with some frequency, right? Not things that are just a one-off, or, a handful for a jurisdiction that makes, tens of thousands of stops.
Sounds like an overall distribution might work best, and then it's fairly easy if we just put it in a format where you could filter out rows where number of observations 1. You just filter that out and then just have the remaining there. So that makes sense then. As far as, I think there was some discussion earlier about where this type of analysis might belong within the context of kind of the outline, and whether this is something to include in that tests section or somewhere else. I think kind of the idea behind the test section is to provide analyses that really get at kind of most of them, with the exception of the residential benchmark tests, are tests that employ statistical significance testing. And it sounds like at the point in time when, or at least right now, what we're considering, this is kind of exploratory, descriptive in nature, and so it might just my personal thought on it, and the board's free to disagree. It might make sense to include in a different section from the general test section, given that those are generally analyses geared towards, again, with the exception of the benchmark.
I think we'll defer to how you lay the report out, and then we'll see it, and then we'll probably have some comments about it. And
that's about how it flows. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Kevin, can I ask one more follow-up? What you're saying makes sense if we can do this, I'll call it like deeper dive into some of the particular infraction codes and finding some of the more prominent ones. But there's also going back and just looking at the, say, moving violations or traffic violations and the equipment violations, if we were just focusing on drivers, for example, or traffic stops. Is it possible within some of the other sections that exist already to also look at those broad categories?
To do something like break down I think we've had discussions about this before, but do something like look at consent searches and those that occur on stops where the reason for stop was a traffic violation, and say what the rates look like there, as opposed to stops where there was another reason for stop. So is that what you're talking about, or am I missing
that's
something?
essentially what I'm getting at. And maybe, and in particular, if something arises from that, it's kind of just stepping back and looking at it broad brushstrokes, then that's even more, that might also be motivation to look more closely in future years too, or even over the summer. So I don't know exactly what the time frame would be for this deeper dive into the basis for stop. But yeah, it might be that there are strong patterns emerging in terms of who stopped for a moving violation versus who stopped for an equipment violation. There have been in the past in other communities, and so we'll see what the statewide data is like. But anyway, so I guess what I'm asking is, even within the sections that are already existing, could you think about if it looks like there are any where this other, cross-tabbing with this as well produces something of a notable disparities? Are this somehow the moving violations versus the equipment violations playing out very differently? So rather than, so this is in addition to, I think this is a fantastic idea to look and see more specifically, given the legal code, which types of stops are happening most frequently. But this is just a broader view in the bins that I think are easier maybe to extract from the RIPA data from the get-go.
I think it would be interesting to do some of to just look at the breakdowns for some of the more broad measures that we look at in the data, and do some breakdowns where we look at them broken down by reason for stop to see if the distributions by just because it was mentioned on timeline, whether this would happen in the summer, et cetera. This is kind of a new idea that's being brought forth at this board meeting that has been discussed previously and worked into the outline. And so just keeping in mind that at the addition of new analyses then, will alter how much time we have to allocate to existing analyses that were planned out. And so we'll have to kind of work on prioritization of what's going to end up in this year's report versus something that maybe starts as discussions and ideas for a type of analysis that may not be able to come to full fruition during the however many months we have, 7 and some change months we have left before this report comes out. So just something those will have to be ongoing conversations, given that this is kind of a new area that we're talking about, analyses that focus on differences across identity group for reason for stop. They're starting out from the ground up at this point. So just something to keep in mind for board members.
Okay. That was a good discussion. I think it was, good use of our time. Any further comments or discussion for the 2022 report? All right. Hearing none, we'll follow along with our agenda. We'll close that item and move on to another opportunity for public comment. So we'll start up north this time, and I'll open the meeting to public comment. Anyone from Northern California? Then
Yeah, 10 clients. I think 10 clients is enough.
I
Yeah.
cut you off.
Yeah. Yeah. I think 10 clients, 2 DoorDash, and I'm going to have 5.
Any other public comment from Central California? And Southern California?
I have one. Hello?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. We started this meeting by discussing the situation in which Asians find themselves. And there's a bit of a hobby horse that I've been riding for a couple of years with respect to Asians. I have many Asians in my family, and I have a son-in-law who is an only child, but he has many Asian brothers. I'll explain. These are people with whom he grew up. Many of them are cops. One day I showed him a screen of citation rates from RITA data, and I said, look at this. The cops are singling out Asians' tickets. And he chuckled and said, you need to understand that Asians are singled out for tickets because they pay them and they do not complain. And I asked him where he got that from. He got it from his brothers, who themselves are Asians. And what I've just described to you is commonplace. There are zero agencies in wave 1 or 2 where Asians are not the leading group in terms of citation disparities as compared to whites. The blacks are on the opposite side. I will assume, therefore, that perhaps blacks are not ticketed because they complain and they will not pay the tickets. This has gone ignored by the California Department of Justice in my many complaints about it, and it got to the point where I was threatened by the CHP. I don't appreciate this. And this business of ignoring what every law enforcement agency seems to be doing to Asians does you no credit. Thank you.
Any other public comment from Southern California? Okay, we'll go ahead and close public comment and entertain a discussion of next steps before we adjourn. Maybe it'd be helpful for DOJ just to kind of, if you can report back on what you've heard so far about next steps so that we can either fill that in, add, or clarify, if that's possible.
Hi, everyone. This is Allison Elgart with the AG's office. So we heard a recommendation to have a standing section added to the outline or at the end of the report on legislative recommendations and updates on prior recommendations made, status of those, etc. There was a discussion on Veil of Darkness, and I think, and whether or not to include it. I think there is a consensus, at least now, to keep it in. But you can all correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's what the consensus was after the whole discussion. There is a desire to do a deeper dive on calls for service and data, and not sure if that will be able to be in this report, or if not this report, then future reports. There was a desire to contextualize the moment in the introduction or somewhere, and explore the idea of next practices and practices that are being developed as we speak. And so acknowledgement of that and a discussion of that. And then we had this great discussion about, excuse me, pretextual stop analysis and figuring out the best way to do that. And I think came to the conclusion that the research center will look at the codes and see if they can determine the frequency and have that be a starting point, at least for the analysis in terms of the different identity groups. Those were my understanding of the main action items. Of course, there was a lot of rich discussion about the report and what everyone wanted to include in it. And we will, of course, go back to all of those notes for specifics. I'm just highlighting the general points, but if others have ones that I missed, please feel free to let me know.
Thank you. Other items for DOJ? I did hear one, and that was a request from the public to respond to a question about officer tracking and stop data. Maybe someone from the research center could just reply back to her via email. Be helpful.
Yes, we will do that. And we are taking notes of all of the comments that are coming in through the chat as well. So we appreciate all the public comments there. And we are recording all of those. I do also just want to make a note that our next board meeting, the full board, just so everybody knows, it was just noticed, so it's scheduled for June 9th. That will be Wednesday, June 9th at 10 a.m. So that will be the next full board meeting. And I think there are discussions among different subcommittees based on, there may be one subcommittee meeting before then for post, depending on, to talk about the review of the academy course. And I think besides that, if we see a need to have another subcommittee meeting, we can pull each subcommittee. But otherwise, we will have additional subcommittee meetings this summer after you've all had a chance to look at some of the development of the report based on the outline you saw today at the June meeting. And then, we will continue to host subcommittee meetings throughout the summer.
Okay. Co-Chair Raphael, anything as we close the meeting and as we adjourn?
No, you're the best co-chair in the world. You do all the work, so I appreciate it.
I'm happy to share that with you for sure. And as we close out the meeting, any final comments from the board? All right, I'll close this out. Again, just thanking DOJ for your continued work and support of the RIPA board. We wouldn't have the great conversations and vast discussions without DOJ, without your work leading up to this point. And appreciate that. And certainly to my colleagues on the board, thank you for your efforts in addressing this important issue and continuing the conversation. That's how we all get better, is continuing the conversation and looking for ways to improve how we perform the services of policing in our community. So thank you for that. With that, we'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you all for your attendance. Thank you to the public for being here, for being on the line for the last 3 hours or so. And we're going to wrap the meeting up an hour ahead of time. So we just gave each other an hour back in your day. So Have a great afternoon, and take care.
Thank you, everyone.